Hello and welcome back to the Arcane Forge. My name's Josh, and today I thought we could begin to cover one of my absolute favourite parts of role-playing games, one of my favourite hobbies, although ultimately it is completely optional for role-playing games. Thanks to the support of my patrons over on Patreon, I've been able to build a setup to film miniature painting videos. Interestingly enough, that's what I was going to do with this channel before I decided to talk more about role-playing games. I've been painting them for absolutely years. I've taken a few commissions over my time for painting miniatures. I absolutely love doing it. Thankfully, the Arcane Forge covers just about all of my massively nerdy hobbies under the umbrella of role-playing games. So I thought we could begin today with some miniature painting and some miniature assembly. Just the absolute basics to begin with, because I know some of you have not tried this kind of thing before, but might be interested. You may not even use miniatures in your games, but hopefully by the end of this little series of videos, you might be encouraged to try. Because although D&D and role-playing games in general are mostly theatre of the mind, miniatures can really enhance your game. It can help you to visualize the scene, make combat easier, solve disagreements about distances, and about environments and layout and things like that when the DM's describing things. So today is going to be the first in a series about miniature painting. I hope to pepper a lot of my Friday videos with things like this, some of the tricks that I've learned over the years. But today, as I say, we're going to start with the absolute basics. We're just going to be covering miniature assembly, and how to clean up your miniatures to start off with, ready for painting. Now, I'm a stickler for detail, so I'm going to be taking you through a lot of little details that you might want to skip some of them. But if you want to follow along with absolutely everything that I do, for today's video, I'll be using glue. I'll be using super glue, plastic glue, and PVA glue. I'll be using clippers or cutters, fine detail cutters for miniatures. I'll be using a mold line remover, but you could also use a craft knife or a scalpel. I'll be using some hobby files, some little tiny files here. I'll be using a substance called green stuff, which I'll talk about later, but it's an epoxy. You can also use clay. I'll be using green stuff rollers. Again, I'll get into that later on. A hand drill, or a miniature modeling drill. I'll be using some baking powder, and tiny little rocks and sand of various different sizes, and some toothpicks. As I say, don't worry, you won't need all of that. If you want to do absolutely everything I do in this video, then that's what I'll be using. I'll try and leave some links down in the description below to show you where I got all this stuff. So the first thing with miniature painting and assembly is to identify what kind of miniature you're looking at painting. If it's of an individual role-playing character, like a Hero Forge miniature that's been 3D printed and designed by you, or some of the amazing WizKids miniatures that you may find that require no assembly, but might need a tiny bit of cleaning up to get rid of evidence of struts from 3D printing or these thin little lines from the resin casting process. Might mess up your paint job a little bit later down the line. Then you might want to skip ahead a tiny bit. However, if like me, you're a miniature fanatic, want to play some miniature war games with these, or use some more complicated and customizable miniatures that come in parts in your role-playing adventures, you may find that your miniatures come in a box, often attached to large sprues, and they need assembling to finish before you can use them. So the first step in this case is to carefully remove any tiny pieces of your models from their sprues using a fine detail set of clippers to ensure that you don't damage any of the pieces of your model or models. When I was younger, I used to just twist these off and I would end up with huge bits of plastic stuck to the ends of my miniatures, and I had no idea how to get rid of them. The clippers have two sides, one flat and one concave end. Just like a Japanese cooking knife, this is so that one side cuts perfectly straight and allows you to maneuver the clippers through the mass of sprues and get exactly where you need to go without leaving too much excess plastic when you remove them from the sprue. Once you've cut out your pieces, you'll need to tidy them up a little bit. As you can see here, this miniature has lots of mold lines left from the resin casting process. Basically, people who sell miniatures will use huge two-part molds filled with resin or plastic and maybe lead or some other white metal. And where they separate these two parts of the mold, you'll usually find these little fine casting lines. As well, we've probably left a few little scratches and bumps from clipping these off the frame, maybe some excess plastic. So I'm just going to take this mold line remover and I'm going to run it down the length of the mold lines that I can see, and this shaves them off really gently. If you don't have a mold line remover, you can always use a hobby knife or a scalpel. The reason I prefer a mold line remover is because it's got no sharp edge to it. It's utterly flat, so there's no chance of me cutting myself or damaging the miniature if I get careless. And I'm just going to come in with a tiny file that I mentioned earlier on and get rid of some of these larger imperfections that the mold line remover can't just shave off. Next, we'll want to assemble all the little tiny bits that we've just tidied up. And a good place to start is with the base of the miniature. Not everybody likes to do it this way though, but I find that if I finish the base and I glue my miniature to that straight away, a really good surface to assemble the rest of the miniature and also to start painting. So I'm going to start at the base. Bases come in lots of different shapes and sizes depending on what sort of game the miniature is originally designed for. They don't impact the painting very much, and as long as they fit on your grid or what have you for role-playing, then it's all good. I'm just going to tidy up the base a little bit as we did with the miniature parts, because they're usually cast from resin or plastic as well, and they have the same little imperfections sometimes. And your base can either be kept clean and blank, or you can use it to evoke a kind of atmosphere and a scene for your miniature to stand in. I personally prefer the latter. There are loads of different ways to do this, but I'm going to show you 2 simple ways that we can do right now. One way is to apply a layer of what's called green stuff that I mentioned earlier. I get mine from an absolutely fantastic company called Green Stuff World. And what it is a 2-part epoxy, which is a chemical which reacts when combined. It's highly sculptable for a few hours and then it sets overnight like rock. So I'm just going to mix some up and apply it to the base here. And you can either spread it out with your fingers like this, which is nice and easy, but it does leave some fingerprints. Or again, if you're a stickler for detail like me, you can use some rolling pins to make sure that they're perfectly level. You can use a simple roller from a bakery supply shop or a hobby shop, as I am here. This is one that I used to use when I was a baker for rolling out fondant icing. But it works perfectly here. Make sure to have some water nearby. This epoxy stuff is really tacky at this stage while it's sculptable, and we don't want it sticking to your rolling pin or your fingers. It'll come off your fingers really easily because they produce a lot of oil just naturally, but a rolling pin, you'll have to scrape all that stuff off if it sticks to it, and if you don't manage to get it all, it might set, as I say, like rock, which will forever damage the smoothness and flatness that this rolling pin can get, essentially rendering it useless. But dipping it in water will create a little tiny barrier between the epoxy and your tools, so you won't end up covering them by accident. Now you can either sculpt into the base and put whatever pattern you'd like in there, floor tiles or bricks or wood panels or what have you. Or if you want to do this really quickly and easily, like I do here, I'm going to be using a patterned rolling pin. Again from Green Stuff World, but you can find them all over the place. Green Stuff World have a lot of different types. But I'm building robots right now, so I'm going to use a sci-fi themed rolling pin for my sci-fi campaign. And when it's done, you should leave it to cure overnight, because it takes quite a while to cure. But I'm terribly impatient, so you can just avoid touching the base as much as possible, and we can move on to the next step. So now you can take some super glue and add it to the bottom of your miniature's feet. I've used a little file here to make the feet slightly rough on the bottom, so the super glue will take quicker and hold a little bit tighter. And then once you put some super glue on there, you can just stick it to your base. If you want to stick your miniature to the base first, or you don't want to buy any of this green stuff, you don't want to buy any rolling pins, or if you have a miniature that comes already attached to a base, another super basic but great basing environment that you can make with ease is to just make some rocky terrain. For this, just get a little bit of PVA glue and some kind of applicator, I'll be using a toothpick, and spread some glue all over the base, making sure not to cover your miniature, but just around its feet. Then you'll need a few different sizes of rocks and sand, and you can buy hobby sand and rocks. They come in all different shapes and sizes and colours and what have you, but they're usually extraordinarily expensive. A little tip therefore could be just to go to your local beach or home improvement or DIY shop, pick up some sand or even some rocks and smash them up into different sizes. Be careful where you do that though. Working from largest to smallest, distribute some of the rocks all over the base. Try not to cluster them too close together, because they draw the eye quite a lot away from your miniature. And finally dip the base in some fine sand to fill all of those little gaps. When you come to paint that, you can make those look like any environment you like, any colour of stone. Anyway, once you've made a base and you've stuck your mini to it, you can assemble the rest of it by gluing the pieces together. Now I like to use super glue because it takes very little time to dry, but there's just long enough to pose various components of your miniature and personalize it before it sets. You might also choose to use a plastic glue, which kind of isn't really a glue. Essentially, provided that both surfaces touching the glue are made of plastic or resin, this glue will basically gently melt the two pieces together, forming a more permanent bond than superglue. The only downside is that it's usually a bit more expensive. It takes slightly longer to set, so you could be holding various tiny little pieces together far longer than you'd enjoy to make sure you get just the right pose. And also it only works on plastic. Now the little robots I'm building have guns. And again, I'm a fanatic for detail, I cannot leave this be, so I want these gun barrels to look a tiny bit more realistic, even though they're sci-fi. So what I'm going to be doing here is using a hand-turned miniature drill to bore out the gun barrel. So I'll select the correct size of drill bit, the size of hole that I want to make in the gun, and then I'll score the surface with a scalpel. This means that it won't jog all over the place or slip when I put some pressure on the drill bit here, because I don't want to miss and drill a different part by accident. And then we're pretty much done. One final mini assembly tip before I'm done though. I learned this watching Luke's Affordable Paint Service, another YouTuber. Make sure to check out his channel if you get the chance. He's a lovely guy, makes very down-to-earth videos, and is usually all about trying to make the hobby a little bit cheaper, because if you're not careful, this hobby can become quite expensive, especially for an optional part of your role-playing experience if you choose to add it in. But either way, Luke's Apps, fantastic YouTube channel. You see this lovely sort of Godzilla style miniature, I can't remember what the actual name of it is now, but basically it looks like Godzilla, from Cool Mini or Not Rising Sun board game. Absolutely stellar board game, incredible miniatures, really great gameplay. I recommend it if you're looking for a new board game to invest in. This miniature is wonderful and very highly detailed, but it has all these little cracks and voids in the joints. Really look pretty naff actually, but it's an easy fix. You might also find these if you've assembled your mini or bought another mini with similar little gaps. And if you'd like to fill them, just find all the little gaps, fill them with a tiny drop of super glue, and when you're done, sprinkle a little bit of baking powder over the top. There'll be this quick chemical reaction, cause basically, not exactly plastic, but basically plastic, to form in the holes and smooth them over. And once this is fully dried, I was a tiny bit impatient and didn't wait for this to dry, but once it's fully dried, just file them down and neaten them up as you would your mold lines from earlier on, and you'll end up with a perfectly smooth miniature. So there we go, that's the basics of miniature assembly. And now we're ready to get painting, which we can cover next time. Make sure to let me know down in the comments if you use miniatures in your role-playing games, or if you're a tabletop wargaming fan as well. I hope you enjoyed this video, guys. I had an absolute blast, and I can't wait to get started with part 2. If you enjoyed this video as well, please make sure to leave it a little like, a little thumbs up down below, maybe favorite it if you found it useful, and share it with someone who you think might get a kick out of this as well, maybe need some tips for miniature assembly. If you like the videos that I make and you want to see more of my stuff, or you want to follow along with this series as I show you how to make miniatures, please make sure to subscribe as well and hit that little bell icon. Keep up to date with everything that I'm making. I make 2 videos a week. Make sure not to miss out. If you want to get more out of the channel, I have a Facebook, an Instagram, a Twitter, a Patreon, and a website, which should be on the screen right now, but I'll leave links down below in the description as well. And until I see you next, happy painting, and I hope you have a lovely day.